This video is sponsored by Magellan TV. Long before the outbreak of World War II, the Empire of Japan began an expansionist policy to stop the influence of Western powers in Asia. After the conquest of Manchuria and Northern China in the 1930s, the Japanese created puppet states and accepted foreign volunteers on its armies to impose the will of the emperor. When the war finally broke out and Japan started conquering British, Dutch, French, and American territories, waves of volunteers of different nationalities joined the ranks of the Imperial Army. Following the footsteps of the Wehrmacht, these foreign soldiers became the spearhead troops of Japanese incursions into new territories, and Chinese, Mongolian, Indonesian, Indian, and many more Asians soon became the eyes and swords of the emperor in lands unknown to the Japanese. To learn more incredible battle stories, watch World War II Battles Won and Lost on documentary streaming service Magellan TV. Every battle is both a victory and a defeat, depending on which side you're on. In this 8-episode series, you'll learn how these battles were decided by strategy, and by which armies could capitalize on the terrain or gain better access to supplies. And now you can take advantage of Magellan TV's special holiday offer. Buy one annual membership and receive a free gift card for another annual membership. Visit try.magellantv.com/darkdocs or click on the link in the description below to begin streaming today. Buy one for yourself and gift one this holiday season, or if you're already a Magellan TV member, gift 2 annual memberships for the price of 1. With over 3,000 documentaries about world history, military, science, mysteries, and space, and with more new content added weekly, you'll never run out of compelling documentaries to watch. Support Dark Docs as you enjoy this exclusive holiday offer for our viewers. Visit try.magellantv.com/darkdocs or click on the link in the description below. The Empire of the Rising Sun. Japan, or the Land of the Rising Sun, has never been a stranger to war. Quite the contrary. Since times of old, its population developed its own warmongering techniques that resulted in moral codes such as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior. The samurai, sometimes compared to the Christian knights of medieval Europe, embodied the old warrior spirit of the Japanese. These old-fashioned fighting men were ruled by the Bushido code, in which honor and bravery led to overall virtues that a man could possess. For centuries, the Japanese closed their doors to the influence of external ideologies, adopting an isolationist posture to prevent contact with men from other nations. But no stone can be left unturned for too long, and European conquistadors arrived in Japan by the mid-16th century. From then on, Japan was introduced to a new age of warfare that ranged from infantry tactics to artillery, arquebusiers, cavalry formations, and more importantly, the employment of foreign mercenaries and military advisors. Then, as the 19th century approached, Japan was forced to open its borders to American trade. The tremendous technological and economic growth that followed in such a short amount of time positioned Japan as the main rival of American and British expansionism in Asia. Now a former empire, the Japanese fought the Russians for the dominance of northeastern Asia, including parts of China, all of Korea, and even the island of Formosa. The Rising Sun also fought in World War I to take control of the territories controlled by the Germans in the continent. Then, as the tides of war rose in Europe in the 1930s, the ambitions of the Empire of the Rising Sun led to diplomatic clashes with the United States. Both nations wanted to stop each other, but neither ceded any ground. Instead, the Empire developed an impressive army, navy, and air force with the cooperation of German advisors from the Third Reich. Long before Japan invaded Manchuria and Northern China in 1931 and 1932, intelligence officers from Tokyo were in communication with Chinese rebels at war with the government. The army would equip these men to help them take control of the region and enforce the laws of the emperor. The same would happen in Mongolia and British, French, and Dutch colonies in Far East Asia. First volunteers. While continuing to establish its supremacy, Japan would use freedom fighters and nationalists to help them rebel against the Westerners and control all of Asia. Following the steps of the Wehrmacht and its recruitment of foreign volunteers to fight the Soviets in the Eastern Front, Japan opened its doors to anyone who wanted to fight the British, Americans, French, and other European nations. The 1941 and 1942 campaigns of Southeast Asia and the Pacific were a testimony to the flux of volunteers that fought alongside the Japanese soldiers. The reasons behind the foreign volunteers' desire to join the Japanese were highly diverse. Some men were attracted to Japan's pan-Asian and anti-colonial propaganda, whose slogan was "Asia for the Asians." Meanwhile, others joined with the firm hope of achieving their country's independence if they supported the Japanese during the war. And then there were others who merely wanted payback against the European settlers. Despite the brutal treatment of the Japanese toward most Asian nations, the Empire's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere managed to attract enough volunteers to create puppet states all over the continent. Then, as World War II continued and the Allied offensives in Asia intensified, the outnumbered Japanese military began to rely heavily on its foreign volunteers to subjugate partisans and neutralize sabotage operations on the occupied territories. Inner Mongolian Army. One of the first auxiliary forces of the Empire of the Rising Sun were nationalists from Inner Mongolia. The first approach between these two cultures dates back to the 13th century when the Golden Horde invaded Japan. Although the Japanese were resentful at first, diplomatic and military communication with Mongolia resurfaced in the 1920s. This union and support aimed to prevent Mongolia from falling into the hands of the Soviets and the Chinese. In 1932, after Japan had conquered Manchuria, their relationship intensified, and Prince Demchugdongrub, a proud Mongolian who sought to make his country powerful during the epochs of Genghis and Kublai Khan, sided with the Japanese. The prince wished to break Inner Mongolia from Chinese rule and joined forces with Japanese agents to accomplish his objective. However, in 1936, he and his fellow Mongolians suffered several defeats after expanding into northern China. Then, a year later, the Mongols and Japanese were defeated once again by the Chinese troops at the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The lack of proper training, equipment, and logistics greatly limited the operational capacity of the Mongolian allies, and after several reorganizations, the Inner Mongolian Army was split into 4 infantry divisions, 2 cavalry divisions, and Chinese brigades that comprised a 10,000-strong force. This structure allowed Prince Demchugdongrub to become the head of the puppet state of Manchuria in 1938. However, his good fortune ran out when in 1945, the Red Army invaded Manchuria and Mongolia and promptly eliminated the poorly trained Mongolian cavalrymen. Collaborationist Chinese Army. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. Then, in 1934, the deposed Emperor of China, Pu Yi, became the ruler of this state and began putting together an army to establish his rule. The armed forces of Manchukuo would eventually surpass 100,000 men, including its own air force and navy. However, that was not enough for the Japanese. As the Imperial Army continued to take control of more areas in China, more puppet states and armies surfaced, including the provisional governments of Peking and Nanking. Both territories amounted to about 5,000 inexperienced soldiers. By 1940, all of these client armies were merged into the reorganized government of the Republic of China. The head of the collaborationist Chinese army was politician Wang Jingwei, who sought to unite China and make it a powerful and developed nation. Wang's pro-Japanese army surpassed 300,000 men by 1943 and included several Japanese tanks and artillery pieces. However, despite the sheer scale of his forces, only the Guards Division, with around 30,000 soldiers, was considered a reliable force. The rest of the army was controlled by warlords of uncertain loyalty. Still, the Chinese volunteers would help the Empire of Japan keep control of all the Chinese provinces and eradicate any revolution attempts. Burmese Independence Army. As the will of the emperor expanded overseas and took control of former British and European colonies, the Japanese intelligence persuaded local politicians and resistance fighters to raise volunteers for their cause. Promises of independence or ethnic privileges drew many to serve the emperor, including Burma and its leader Aung San. Before the invasion, a secret force of Burmese men was trained by the Japanese on Hainan to support the Imperial Army when they decided to strike before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Once accomplished, the Japanese created the Burmese National Army to help them conquer the region. The army would eventually grow into a force of 200,000 uncontrollable volunteers that committed atrocities against several minorities in Burma. Then, after fighting the British in 1943, Aung San quickly grew tired of the Japanese grip. And by 1945, he rebelled against Japan and declared Burma an independent country after engaging in talks with the Allies. Indian and Indonesian volunteers. Although the Japanese never considered India a part of its Pan-Asian alliance or area of dominion, the Empire decided to weaken the bulk of the British Indian Army by aiding factions that sought independence from the English. After negotiating the creation of an Indian Legion with Adolf Hitler, Subhas Chandra Bose declared the independence of a Singapore-based provisional government of Free India in 1943 with the support of the Japanese. The Indian National Army comprised 40,000 men and participated in the engagements of Arakan, Impal, and Burma, but ultimately failed to convince the British Indian soldiers to defect and join the Japanese. Meanwhile, the Indonesian volunteers experienced a different fate. After founding the Pembela Tanah Air in 1943, a volunteer militia of 50,000 men was distributed across Java and Sumatra to impose order. The men never saw combat, and in 1945, Indonesia declared its independence. Most of the enlisted men became the founding pillars of the Indonesian army. Legacy. Ultimately, the foreign allies of the Imperial Japanese Army were not as effective as the Empire intended. This was in part because of their very strict racial policies and the little training they received. However, as the war turned against them, Japan relied more on these troops to protect their rearguard and supply lines. Eventually, even these mercenaries were persuaded by the Western powers to fight against the Japanese. The participation of foreign volunteers continues to be a disputed topic, and just like it happened with the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, there were foreign Japanese units who were greatly underestimated and proved their worth on the battlefield. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content. And let us know in the comments below what you think of the allies of the Imperial Japanese Army during their conquest of Asia and the Pacific.